Hello, I'm Marianne Mashiri. This is the Iran War Today, our BBC News briefing bringing you up to date with all you need to know from the last 24 hours of the US war with Iran. Well, let's start with some of today's key developments now. Iran says it's agreed a shipping route with Oman in the Strait of Hormuz that could pave the way for the vital waterway to reopen. It follows more threats of military action by Donald Trump if Iran doesn't agree a deal for free passage. Yemen's Houthi rebels say they've attacked a Saudi oil tanker in the Red Sea as the Iran-backed group look to strengthen their blockade on Saudi ships trying to circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. Israel conducts strikes in southern Lebanon, accusing Hezbollah of violating the ceasefire. It comes as hundreds of thousands of displaced Lebanese people begin to return home. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the UN says 56 people have been executed since mid-March on charges relating to national security. Well, we start with Iran saying it's reached an understanding with Oman on the exact pathway for a shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran says a joint agreement is now being finalised, providing, as they put it, third parties don't interfere. But the country's foreign ministry spokesperson caveated the announcement, saying the agreement would not guarantee security in the waterway. Well, straight to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, who's with me now. How significant is this understanding between Oman and Iran?
I think, to paraphrase Sir Winston Churchill, this isn't the end of the war. This isn't even the beginning of the end, but it could be the end of the beginning, because this could well be the best chance of and I hate this expression, an off-ramp, but a way out of the current impasse, the quagmire that Donald Trump has got himself into with this war, where he's faced with only two choices: escalation, and they're running out of missiles and interceptor missiles, and running out of targets, for that matter, in Iran, and making themselves increasingly unpopular back home domestically, or accepting a very unpalatable deal. Now, while there may or may not be negotiations going on between the US and Iran, the US says there is, Iran says there isn't, there definitely have been these negotiations going on between the two littoral states, the two coastal states, Iran and Oman. And the deal that they have come up with, we pretty much knew the parameters of this for the last 24 hours, but this is the firmest confirmation we've had yet, coming from Iran's foreign ministry, specifically from the foreign ministry's spokesman, Ismail Beghai, who says that there would be a northern route whereby inbound traffic to the Gulf would kind of cling to the Iranian coast and would be under some kind of Iranian control, probably meaning inspection, possibly some kind of fees, and outbound traffic would go a southern route closer to Oman's coast, and Iran would have a much looser surveillance over that, and Oman would have a bit of control. Now, what we don't know is whether that is going to be acceptable to Donald Trump. I think for the Gulf Arab states, they're not going to like it, but it's probably a lot more palatable to them than endless war, which is what they're faced with. And what that means is endless US airstrikes on Iran, or intermittent ones, a blockade, and counterstrikes by Iran on their infrastructure in places like Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and so on. So this could well be the best way out of it. Probably a better and easier deal to do than the Memorandum of Understanding, which was very loose on language, loose on specifics, and was heavily criticised. This at least is a deal that's got, some serious negotiation that's taken place in it, and it's acceptable to Oman, which has, of course, got a stake in the Strait of Hormuz. It's one of the two states on that Gulf passageway.
OK, Frank, stay right there. We're going to come back to you on another matter, because I want to get your thoughts on the rising tensions between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. Now, to bring you up to date, there have been more claims of strikes by the Houthis on a Saudi tanker in the past 24 hours, 2 weeks after the Iran-backed group declared what it called a maritime blockade against Saudi shipping. Now, remember, since the start of the Iran war, Saudi Arabia has rerouted around 70% of its oil exports to their Red Sea port of Yanbu, with the aim of transporting oil exports through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south, or the Suez Canal in the north. Well, in July, the Houthis said they'd closed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south to Saudi tankers, and the latest strikes have targeted ships in the northern parts of the Red Sea. So back to our security correspondent, Frank, and the Houthis say that these attacks are part of the blockade. How credible, though, is that, do you think?
Well, this is essentially a second front in the US-Iran war by extension. The Houthis' beef is with the Saudis. They fought a 7-year war. The Saudis invaded Yemen, backed by the what's called the IRG, the internationally recognized government of Yemen, to try and dislodge the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. I know it's complicated, this, but more recently, the Saudis did something which I think they may have now come to regret. They bombed Sana'a airport, reportedly to stop an Iranian plane landing with returning Houthis from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's funeral. And the Houthis have responded, and they've been trying to blockade Saudi oil exports. They've not been blockading anybody else, but they now say they have targeted 8 Saudi ships so far. And you saw from that map there how vital this export terminal is, because, okay, so the Gulf is stymied. They haven't been able to get most of their oil exports out through the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, they've used this east-west pipeline, shipped 5 million barrels plus per day to Yanbu al-Bahr, as it's called, and then either north through Suez or south through the Bab el-Mandeb. But now the Houthis have fired ballistic missiles at Yanbu. In other words, we, Iran's friends and allies, can get you anywhere. And there's, don't think that you can just bypass the Gulf, because we can stymie we can paralyze your oil exports. So you better have a deal, and you better live with us and stop having any kind of a conflict with us. So, even though Saudi Arabia is a massively more powerful and richer country than impoverished Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world, and yet, once again, by dint of geography, the Houthis are able to flex their muscles and say, no, we control the southern exit to the Red Sea. If we deem it, we can threaten all shipping coming down through the Red Sea. And I've been through that narrow strait. It's very narrow. You only need 1 or 2 drones, a couple of missiles, maybe a few speedboats, just like in the Strait of Hormuz, to be able to threaten shipping. So it's, for Iran, this is a second front to put pressure on America's Gulf Arab allies, in this case, Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Frank, thank you very much. Well, the Israeli military has ordered residents of a town in southern Lebanon to leave their homes, the first such order since mid-June, after IDF warplanes conducted a wave of strikes in and around the area of Mansouri. In a post on social media, the Israel Defense Forces said it was conducting what it called precision strikes in South Lebanon in response to a violation of June's ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, although it did not specify what the violation was. Lebanese authorities say at least 1 person has been killed and 11 injured. Since the ceasefire was signed in June, fighting has decreased, but Israeli forces still maintain control of much of southern Lebanon. They've demolished houses and even villages from where they say Hezbollah had been operating. Despite this, the United Nations now says more than 800,000 people who've been displaced have begun returning home. The fighting had forced more than 1 million to flee. Karine Torbay sent this from Beirut.
Most of the people displaced by the war in South Lebanon have returned to their hometowns. That is over 800,000 people, who make up almost 80% of the people who were displaced by Israeli strikes. But they return to areas that are heavily destroyed, with no infrastructure. Water, electricity, and other main basic needs have been heavily damaged by Israeli strikes, and many schools and hospitals have been badly affected. The cost of reconstruction for these areas is in the billions of dollars in a country that has severe economic and financial problems, and where international aid has become scarce. The new figure about the returnees mean that more than 300,000 people remain displaced and are probably not going to be able to return anytime soon, and their villages are under Israeli occupation with no plans for any Israeli withdrawal anytime soon. These villages witness near daily demolitions by the Israeli forces, and no one here knows the exact scale of destruction in the occupied towns. But the Israeli finance minister has said that the Israeli army completely destroyed 24 villages in southern Lebanon, and that residents have nowhere to return to. Israel claims it is destroying Hezbollah's infrastructure, but the United Nations human rights chief said demolition of this type raises huge flags about compliance with international humanitarian law and described the demolitions as wholesale destruction of civilian homes.
That was Karine Torbay from BBC Arabic. The United Nations says it is alarmed by the increase in executions inside Iran since March. The UN's human rights body says it believes 56 people have been executed on what they described as national security-related charges since the 19th of March. That includes at least 27 cases linked to the huge anti-government protests which we saw in December and January. Well, let's bring in BBC Persian special correspondent Kasra Naji. And Kasra, is this consistent with the numbers of people that we saw being put to death before the start of the war or not?
Before the start of the war, possibly not, because they started sort of increasing this number of executions in the last several weeks. So, yeah, it's after that. And, of course, we're talking about the events of January, where, you know, according to human rights organizations, thousands of people were gunned down by the security forces in various towns and cities across the country. And in Shiraz, I know in the last few days there were concerns that a wrestler, a decorated wrestler, who was arrested there during those the unrest and protests, he was about to be executed. He hasn't been, thankfully, but there are a lot of concern that the number is going to go up.
So what do we know about the anti-government movement right now in Iran? Does it still exist following those huge protests at the start of the year? We remember Donald Trump said he was going to send help. What's the story now with protests?
Absolute quiet for the moment. People are watching and seeing, you know, what comes next. Of course, there's been a war, so that whips up nationalistic feelings. That has to be taken into account too. Also, the regime has decided to occupy the streets so that the protesters won't come to the streets. So what we're seeing in Iran, in the big cities, big towns, is that pro-regime supporters are coming out every night out on the streets to have rallies and listen to speakers and so on and wave flags. So they are occupying the streets in the fear that if we leave it and there's a vacuum, the protesters might take over. But for the moment, there is no sign of any anti-government protests for the moment. Of course, as you said, President Trump had said, you know, help was on its way, and both him and Benjamin Netanyahu, both of them were in fact counting on people to come out on the streets and overthrow the regime. The strategy at the beginning of the war was that we will weaken the security forces to the point that the population will feel free to come out on the streets and take over various government centers and centers of power. It didn't happen. It didn't come to that because I don't know why, but I guess the reason was that the regime still had pretty much the control of the streets, even though, you know, the bombings were happening left, right, and center, but the streets, the regime managed to keep control of the streets.
Okay, Kasra, thank you very much indeed. Now, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening on Sounds or watching on TV, thank you for your time. That's all for this edition of the Iran War Today.